Today I wanted to sit and talk with you all about the differences between Zimbabwean healthcare and my experiences with the UK healthcare, because this topic isn't quite as clear-cut as I think a lot of people outside of this country might think. I certainly came to Zimbabwe with more than a few prejudices about what I expected the healthcare system out here to be like, and I was proven wholeheartedly wrong, so today I want to share that with all of you guys. If this is your first time on the channel, welcome and ahoy! I'm Captain Benzie, also known as the Bulawayo Buccaneer, and on this channel I try to showcase what it's like for me as a Brit living in Zimbabwe. I talk about the differences between life in the UK and life in Zimbabwe, and I want to showcase the best that this magnificent country has to offer. If this isn't your first time on this channel, welcome back, and I hope you enjoy this video every bit as much as you've enjoyed my previous ones. This channel and my content are not sponsored in any way, so if you do want to help support content like this, you can do so cheaply and easily just by heading down below, clicking that like button, and subscribing if you haven't already. It really does help. And if you do want to go the extra mile to help me keep doing what I'm doing, then I have both a Patreon page where you can pledge to support, I have a Redbubble merchandise store where you can pick up some really cool Bulawayo Buccaneer swag, and I have a PayPal tip jar if you want to toss me a couple of dollars to get myself a coffee or something. Every little really does help, and thank you all so much. So, Zimbabwean healthcare versus British healthcare, what's the difference? In this video, I'm going to go over 3 different aspects. First of all, we're going to have a look at your day-to-day visits to a GP or general practitioner when you're just feeling a little bit ill or you need a checkup or something. Secondly, we're going to have a look at what hospitals are like, because I have had experience with hospitals out here and in the UK. Thirdly, we're going to have a look, of course, because we can't not at this point in history, we're going to talk about the COVID-19 vaccine rollout and how that went out here. Now, the inspiration for this video came yesterday when Carrie woke up with really bad toothache, so we phoned the dentist, booked an appointment, and went down there. Unfortunately, she did have to have a root canal, which wasn't a particularly pleasant experience for her, but she worked through it like an absolute trooper. We got the bill at the end, and I looked at it and I went, what? That's a lot cheaper than I was expecting. That's cheaper than it would be in the UK. And that got me to thinking what the real differences between Zimbabwean and British healthcare were, hence this video. So the first part of this that we're going to talk about is your general day-to-day access to healthcare, mainly going to visit your GP or general practitioner. Now, in the UK, we do have 2 different types of healthcare. We have public healthcare offered by the NHS or National Health Service, completely free at the point of use. Payment for it comes from the government, usually raised by taxes, national insurance, that kind of thing. On the other hand, we do have private healthcare as well, but there aren't many people who tend to use it. Private healthcare in the UK is very expensive, and thus the only people I've ever met that use private healthcare are either people who have it packaged as a perk of their employment, or people who are far richer than I will ever be. So what this basically translates to is that when I felt ill in the UK, I would just make an appointment with my local GP's office, I would head down there, I would be seen, I would speak to the doctor, he might perform a couple of basic tests, give me an examination, and then would refer me to a hospital for further need if required, or would write a prescription for a treatment if he thought that was the best option. At this point in time, I will have spent absolutely nothing. Picking up the prescription costs a nominal fee, about £7.50, so you're looking around $8–9 there, not much, and that's irrelevant to what the prescription actually is. And of course there's an aircraft going overhead. Things in Zimbabwe, though, are very, very different. Now, we do still have government-run public clinics, but we also have private clinics. You'll find that most people, however, use those private clinics, not least because the government-funded ones are, well, not really funded. Ultimately, the only people who really use the public clinics are those who don't have access to the private ones, either because they simply can't afford it, or because there literally isn't one nearby. If you're living in rural Zimbabwe, you might find that you only have a public clinic handy, and that's exactly what my experience with it was. I was living at Gorges Lodge at the time, which is a fair distance outside of Victoria Falls town, and we thought I possibly might have malaria. Malaria is a very serious disease disease out here. It kills a lot of people, and so awareness of it and treatment of it are actually really top-notch. And this clinic was fantastic. The treatment and the service that I received, ultimately, I didn't pay for because of that drive to stop malaria. But that clinic was everything that I had prejudicedly believed an African clinic would be. We had to drive past cattle to get to it. It was literally a tin shack on the edge of the rural village of Chisuma. To say that it was run down would be unfair. The inside was still clean, the staff were friendly, very polite and helpful. They gave me a malaria test where they prick your finger, take a drop of blood, and use that to check whether or not you have it. Fortunately, I didn't. But it was absolutely clear at this point that this clinic does not get any funding whatsoever. This was clearly a clinic that had issues, and ultimately, I don't want to get into the politics of that. They are incredibly good with what they have available. Now, the private clinics, on the other hand, these are what most people in Zimbabwe use, and to say that they're expensive would be a lie. If we're comparing this to, say, the American healthcare system, yeah, it's remarkably cheap. Your average visit to your GP might be somewhere between $10 and $25. But for some people, that's still pretty high, which is why we have medical aid. Companies like Masker, which you can sign up to, and you pay a monthly fee, and they will support your medical fees as you go on otherwise, and this is a very common perk of employment. There are some issues with the health insurance in Zimbabwe as well. Because of the financial situation, a lot of health insurance companies do require that you pay it up front and then they will pay you back at a future date, which does still mean you need to have all of that money backed up. I mentioned this in my 5 difficulties video. Having to think about savings and having money put away somewhere, squirreled away somewhere, so that if something goes wrong, you do have that there. Whether or not you have medical aid, that bill is still there in your head, and you still have to think about that. If you don't have the money, what do you do? And that brings us nicely to the second part that I want to talk about in today's video: hospitals. Now, fortuitously, my experience with hospitals in the UK has primarily been second-hand. Most of my time spent inside a hospital has been visiting other people. I have been to hospital a few times, I have been rushed in an ambulance and had care, I have overnighted a couple of times, but literally 2 or 3 times. A typical experience could be described with a story from one day when I was working back in the UK. I was doing a delivery for a shop that I worked at when I started to get a tingling numbness spreading up my arm. I phoned the emergency services, who noted my symptoms and then said to me, "Please sit down. Don't get too stressed out by this, but those could be signs of a heart attack. We're sending a paramedic team now." So the paramedics came, they picked me up from work in a stretcher, wheeled me out to an ambulance, drove me to the hospital where I was thoroughly tested, and it turned out no, it wasn't a heart attack. I never had to worry about paying for it. I knew that no matter what happened, I was going to be all right, and I would come out the other end without having a humongous bill, and that is just so comforting. But it means if you were in a car crash, or you were hit by a car, or you fell down a cliff, or some other equally catastrophic event occurred to you, you know that the ambulance is going to pick you up, take you to hospital, give you the best care you can, and when you are finally able to leave the hospital, that's it. No bill, nothing. Not so in Zimbabwe, and this is best illustrated with a story from a couple of years ago when Carrie and I were living in Victoria Falls. I'd spent a weekend in some rather intense gut pain. We went off to the doctor first thing on Monday morning, which we had to pay for. We got a load of scans and tests done, which we had to pay for, only to be told that, yep, that's your appendix. You need to be in emergency surgery this afternoon in Bulawayo, a 6-hour drive away. My first thought was, how the heck do we pay for that? And so we had to go home, and with me having just been told I needed emergency surgery, I'm having to phone up my parents. Carrie's phoning her parents. We're phoning friends and family and anyone we can think of to say, look, Ben needs money now. And I had to go around begging for money to save my own life. Then Carrie and I jumped in the car and we shot through to Bulawayo as fast as we could. We arrive in Bulawayo, we go to sleep because everything's closed. Next morning, we wake up bright and early. I go off to the hospital, Carrie goes to actually look for the surgeon because the hospital doesn't have its own resident surgeons. You have to hire the surgeon separately. So we've got details of a surgeon, she goes off and speaks to him. She comes back to the hospital to find me still sitting outside on the curb because I can't be admitted until full payment has been given. And I've got 3/4 of the payment sitting in my account, but we're waiting for the last couple of $100 to come in, and the hospital would not let me in, would not admit me until the full bill had been paid. Finally, with me admitted and the surgeon all paid for, I was given my IV, I was sent down to the operating theatre, and then put under general anaesthetic, which alone was terrifying as someone who had never experienced that in my life. A couple of hours later, I woke up minus one appendix, and I was fairly well looked after that. The nurses were great, the staff was great, the anaesthetist who had put me under kept paying visits and telling me random jokes and making my sides literally hurt with laughter. The overall experience was genuinely pretty good. That said, private hospitals are only half of the story here in Zimbabwe, and we do have public hospitals, though again, there's a lot of difficulties there. Now, when we say that a hospital is a public hospital, what we really mean is that it's a government-owned and funded hospital, and therein lies the issue here in Zimbabwe. There's been a lot of issues with hospitals and staff over the past few years since they reintroduced the Zim dollar. Basically, nurses have not had their pay increased, doctors have not had their pay increased. A lot of the funding, part of government funding, just hasn't been there, to the point that Zimbabwe completely lacks any MRI machines. If you are a cancer patient in this country and you want to use public hospitals, or you're stuck using public hospitals, it's not a good outcome for you. I think there is one MRI machine in Harare, but there's no specialist to use it, so it just sits there with no one to operate it. Public hospitals could be great. We know that the healthcare professionals are well trained. We know that those hospitals are still clean. They just don't have the funding, they don't have the equipment, they don't have the things that they need to actually give and provide a healthcare service. And on that rather dark and harrowing note, let's continue the theme by talking about the third thing I wanted to talk about in this video, the COVID-19 vaccine rollout. Because it's impossible to talk about healthcare in 2022 without mentioning the global pandemic. Now, when COVID first hit Zimbabwe back in early 2019, things got very bleak very quickly, but they did pick up. Now, I was living and working in Victoria Falls at that point in time, and everything shut down almost instantly. Then the government turned around and said, nope, COVID-19 is here, we are locking down, and it was a complete mandatory lockdown for a full 2 weeks. And it was very swiftly followed by a country utterly unprepared for this kind of situation, a pandemic that we didn't know what was going on. We have hospitals that are going into closure anyway just through lack of funding. You've got nurses and staff talking and debating about their pay because they're not being paid properly. Then a global pandemic hits and we were just woefully unprepared. We had some harrowing stories. There's an article, I'll see if I can find and put in the description down below, of one family whose son came down with COVID, and basically they were told the hospital is not equipped for this, and in no uncertain terms, if you don't equip the hospital, your son will die. And they had to go and find their own private ventilator. They then had to source that and then donate it to the hospital. And all the time, the hospitals are scrambling to build wings purely dedicated to COVID, and it was a dark time. It was a dark time the world over, and I don't really want to get too far into it in this, but for Zimbabwe it hit hard because the country was just woefully unprepared. At one point, the testing was completely for free, but that didn't last long, and it very swiftly became $15 to $20. And that's at a time when $15 to $20 is a lot of this country's monthly income. Like, genuinely, when you have to choose between spending your entire paycheck on getting a test for a disease you might have, or you could spend it on the necessities like food and water, most people know which one they're going to go for. And this meant that COVID spread quickly, it spread fast, and it was just everywhere. This didn't last for too long. Eventually, the Chinese saved the day. The Chinese turned around and said, Sinovac and Sinopharm, here is an entire massive shipment of these two vaccines. They are not as effective as some of the ones in the West, but partially effective is better than not effective, and you can have all of this completely for free on one condition. you do not charge for it. Every hospital was giving these out for free. You could rock up, get your vaccine, be given your vaccination card, good care, off you go. 2 weeks later, come back for the second part. If you were part of one of the medical aid societies, they were rolling out as well. If it was a hospital that was run by Masker or whoever, they would naturally prioritize their own customers first. But they did eventually get round to just offering it to everyone. Everyone and anyone could get that vaccine completely free, and masking was mandatory, washing your hands and sanitizing on entrance to a shop. Ultimately, the COVID situation is one of those that it started out really, really badly, and it very quickly became an absolute success story. Anyone who wanted to be vaccinated could be. Ultimately, we got through it, and as a country, COVID is all but gone here from Zimbabwe, but a lot of us do still try to mask up when we can. We still do show those precautions, and I think that comes back to the African spirit of Ubuntu. I am good because you are good, and people out here are willing to go that extra step and wear a mask if it means that they're protecting other people, and you can sell that to a Zimbabwean. I am good because you are good. I will wear a mask because it helps protect you. I will get vaccinated because it helps protect you, and it's been pretty good. Anyway, folks, that brings us to the end of another video. So first of all, thank you ever so much for watching and supporting me and my content. It really does mean a lot to me. I watch my analytics and I see how many of you stick through a video. I see the likes, I see the comments, and it just means the world to me how supportive you all are. I hope you're enjoying these kind of videos, and if you are, I would love to hear your thoughts and opinions of what you would like to see in future videos. I'm hoping that in the new year, after the Christmas period has finally died off and I have money again, I can actually go traveling with Carrie and see places like the Eastern Highlands, maybe head up to Mshvingo and Great Zimbabwe and places like that. But if you've got topics that you'd like me to talk about, like the differences between the UK and Zimbabwe, let me know. Put your comments down below, hit that like button, and once again, thank you all so much for that support.